The iconic Nelson's Column in Trafalgar Square in the heart of London, an iconic city where there are landmarks galore that are globally famous. But there are particular buildings, locations in this city that if you go around them, you can fit together the pyramid of power and control that really runs the world, as opposed to the centers of power that appear to run the world. And in a recent video, I talked about two worlds. The world that people think is the real world, the one they think they're interacting with and living in every day, and then the other world that is running parallel with the real world and manipulating and controlling events here. And what I'm going to do today, with a tour around particular locations in London, is to put together this pyramid of power through which this other world manipulates this one. People have called it the deep state. You could call it the permanent government. While you have the here today, gone tomorrow politicians and prime ministers and presidents, the permanent government, the deep state, is always there. And it's that which is always there that we have to keep our eyes on, because through that, the same agenda, the same direction of the world can continue no matter what the color or nature of the politicians or party in power at any time. Okay, this is our first location on our London tour of the real power centres, Buckingham Palace. Now, I've not come here to say the British royal family rule the world, although they certainly are the family purely through bloodline that produce the head of state in this country, and of course have tremendous influence across many other countries through the Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and all the others. But this is the first location, and what I'm doing is starting at the top of this pyramid and I'm going down through it as we go around the streets of London. And this represents the bloodline. In a video I did recently, which was headed Possession and Reptilians Are Real, which really should be watched in conjunction with this, I talked about the fact that there were bloodlines seeded or encoded. If you watch that video, you see what I mean by that. By a non-human race, a non-human force, created hybrid bloodlines that were part human and part this force. And these bloodlines appeared in the ancient world, and they became known as the royal and aristocratic bloodlines. Why? Because they claimed to have a particularly special genetics that was different and more special than the rest of the population. And this continued with royalty overtly leading countries and dictating to countries. And then when people around the world started rejecting that and demanding more say in affairs, this bloodline, although it still exists as royalty here behind me, went into the dark suit professions of politics and business and banking and media ownership and all these other areas that control human society. But they still, whether they're wearing a crown or a dark suit, they still see themselves as royalty, as this special hybrid bloodline. And this is what secret societies, in the deep inner center of secret societies, are hiding from the public. And so at the top of the pyramid you have this bloodline, and it controls banking, business, corporations, the governments, etc., on behalf of this hidden force. And another name for this bloodline elite these days is the 1%. And if we think about it, people would think, oh, what do you mean, bloodline? What's that got to do with it? That's ridiculous. That's nonsense. And why is bloodline important anyway? And it's just nonsense. But let's just think about it. This family, the current Queen Elizabeth II, is head of state in this country for one reason, and that is her bloodline. If she was from a different family bloodline, she would not be head of state. So here we are, never mind through history, here we are in 2018 with the head of state in Britain being decided by genetics. And this is an example of it in your face, but you go deeper into it, and this bloodline, this particular hybrid genetics, is what is behind world events and the direction of the world. And they have a structure, you can see it as a pyramid structure, or you can see it as a web with the spider at the center and the web going out from it. But either way of looking at it, you're looking at a hierarchy, a top-down hierarchy of control with the bloodline at the top. So we have this bloodline at the top of this symbolic, well, actually literal pyramid hierarchy. And to keep knowledge of the bloodline, and indeed the agenda and manipulations of the bloodline, secret from the target population, then we have a massive global network of secret societies. The most exclusive ones are close to the spider in the symbolic web or close to the top of the pyramid. And then you come down through less exclusive ones until you eventually come out of the hidden and into the seen. I'll talk about that later. Now, one of the great global centers for this hierarchy is the City of London. And I'm not talking about the great conurbation and urban sprawl of the Greater London. I'm talking about an area, which this is the entrance to, known as the City of London, or more often, the City. It's the square mile is another name. It's the center of finance and banking, not just in Britain, but it's a major global center too. And how appropriate that when you enter the City of London, you have the flying reptile on both sides of the road, and the logo of the City of London is two flying reptiles holding a shield with a red cross on a white background. And you would think, oh yeah, well that's the flag of England, but it's also the logo of something else, the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar are an ancient secret society that started around 900 years ago and owned this whole area of land here. And as I'll come to shortly, we're very connected to Jerusalem and the Crusades. And the Knights Templar eventually officially disbanded after operating in the open for about 200 years. But they only officially disbanded. They then went out of the seen into the unseen, into the secret society network. And this whole area here, including the area of the financial district, is to a very large extent controlled by the Knights Templar. And a stream, it is actually controlled by the Knights Templar and a stream of other secret societies and guilds and livery companies which dictate events in the City of London. The City of London financial district has its own government and its own police force. It is in many ways, although it doesn't accept this officially, it's a separate state, something like the Vatican, in the way that it operates. And from here, so much of the global financial system is manipulated. And as I mentioned earlier, this bloodline is a hybrid of a human field and a non-human field, and that non-human field is dominated by entities that take a reptilian form. So the flying reptile at the entrance to the City of London, holding the symbol of the Knights Templar, who hold the secrets of the bloodline and the hierarchy and its agenda, is not just appropriate, not just symbolic, it's telling you how things are. Well, we're going to go into the City of London just a little later, but I want to talk first about this area next, well, part of it's next to the City of London, part of it's in the City of London, and it's called the Temple. And the reason it's named is after a Knights Templar temple, which we'll see shortly. And this temple area is the center of the control of the legal system. I'll go into more of that when we get into the heart of this temple area. But if you control the law and you control banking, and the Knights Templar and this other connected secret society network controls both, then you already have a tremendous basis, foundation for global control. Okay, well, I've got to be a bit careful now because I've filmed here before and there's cameras everywhere and they're straight on you. You can't film here, mate. Because we've entered this area of the temple, after which the temple is named, and that's the Temple Church of the Knights Templar. If you watch the movie, The Da Vinci Code, you'll know the church I'm leaving. It goes back to something like the 12th century when it was first started to be built, and it was the headquarters of the Knights Templar all that time ago, and has here we are going past it. And it was also the Royal Treasury, because the Knights Templar were in so many ways the founders of what has become known as the global banking system and all that goes on not far from here around the Bank of England in the City of London. And the Knights Templar had a massive connection to Jerusalem. They fought in the Crusades to win Jerusalem from the Muslim rulers. That's the Temple Church here. And the Knights Templar actually were based, or had some Templars based in Jerusalem at Temple Mount, where today that big mosque still stands. And they were obsessed then with rebuilding Solomon's Temple, the alleged Solomon's Temple, on that site. And they have been obsessed with it ever since, as the Knights Templar have gone into the realm of secrecy instead of operating openly. And how funny then that one of the great goals today of Zionism, which is also a secret society at its core, which locks into this other network, is to replace the mosque in Jerusalem with a rebuilt Solomon's Temple. And this movement of the American embassy to Jerusalem is all part of the process, the stepping stones towards that. And you're going to see more talk about that as the years pass, because that's been the idea all along. It's all part of the ritual, it's all part of mythology, and it goes even deeper than that into the literal. So this is the temple church, from which the whole area here, the temple, gets its name. And the Knights Templar only disbanded publicly, not in fact. And they are a dominant force in the temple and the city of London and further afield today. And we got to do that without anyone coming, which is a first for me. So here we are at the heart, in many ways, not just of the British legal system, but of the global legal system. This area of the temple, this Knights Templar land, which now, instead of controlling it, owning it openly, Knights Templar and other secret societies connected with it controls this from the background, from the shadows. But it's still the same thing. After the Templars officially disbanded, they continued in secret, and following their demise in the 14th century, officially, the area here of the temple became the center of the legal profession, and they used the same terms, the same symbols, even in many ways the same names that they did before. There are 4 what they call Inns of Court here, and the Inns of Court are what you have to be a member of to be a barrister or a judge in this country, and in many ways further afield. And these Inns of Court are called the Middle Temple, the Inner Temple, Gray's Inn, and Lincoln's Inn. And behind me, that vast building with the flying reptile in front of it is the Royal Courts of Justice. Justice. You have to control the legal system to impose your power. It's one of the areas you must control. That's why they do. And I'm not saying that every barrister is a secret society manipulator, or every judge is corrupt. But the point is, there are corrupt barristers, there are corrupt judges, and many of them take their orders from the secret society network that controls the temple, and thus when a case is being heard, for instance, which they want a particular result, they'll make sure that the judge and the personnel in the court, as much as they can, the barristers, will be on team in terms of in court seeking the outcome that the secret society network wants. If a government wants a particular outcome of a case for political reasons, then they can appoint a particular judge to that case and ensure that they get the result they want. This is how it works. Like I say, having that flying reptile in the middle of it all is not even symbolic. It's in many ways literal in terms of what mentality controls this place. The building behind me is the Mother Lodge of Freemasonry, the United Grand Lodge of England. It was from here that Freemasonry was basically taken around the world, not least to North America. Well, when people talk about secret societies, one of the first names that comes up, if not the first, is Freemasonry. And you hear a lot when people are talking about manipulation of the world, it's the Freemasons. Well, it is, but not in that all-encompassing way necessarily, because secret societies are fiercely compartmentalized. You have the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, for instance, with its 33 degrees, and yet the vast majority of Freemasons are on the bottom 3 levels of degrees, so-called blue degrees. And each level represents a level of knowledge of what Freemasonry is about and what it's really doing. And so when you hear Freemasons in lower degrees saying, what you're saying about the Freemasons, it's not happening. Oh, it's good for business and might do a bit of manipulation, get a few contracts, but it's not what you're talking about, this manipulation of the world. But at that level, they won't have that information because it's fiercely compartmentalized. The whole hierarchy is the same and based on the need to know basis, only letting people need to know what they need to know to make their contribution without knowing how their contribution connects with everyone else's to create a very clear picture. But Freemasonry is not the most important of the secret societies. It's much more lower down, if you like, the secret society hierarchy, and the much more exclusive ones, including the Knights Templar and others, that are much closer to the spider or much higher to the top of the hierarchical pyramid, whichever way you want to look at it. But at the inner core of Freemasonry, which incidentally was an outgrowth of these earlier secret societies, you do have an inner core that is absolutely in full knowledge of what Freemasonry is really about and how it locks into many other secret societies. And you see the same recurring themes because this bloodline has come through history and the secret societies have come through history with the bloodline. You see the same recurring themes. One of them, for instance, is you'll see beside that door 2 pillars, the twin pillars of Freemasonry. Well, that's also the twin pillars of Solomon's Temple. I'll mention more about that when we get to Westminster Abbey, and encompass religion also into this secret society network. Another thing that's very significant is that this Mother Lodge of Freemasonry is in a street here in London called Great Queen Street. Now, you chart back this secret society network, its origins, and you get to places like ancient Babylon. And in Babylon, the Great Queen was Queen Semiramis. Queen Semiramis was part of a trinity worshipped in Babylon of Nimrod, the father god, Queen Semiramis, the mother, and Tammuz, the virgin-born son. And when this bloodline and its secret society network moved out of Babylon and located in Rome, this morphed, the same religion morphed into the Christian Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And the Holy Ghost is symbolized in Christianity by the dove. And the symbol of Queen Semiramis in Babylon was the dove. And all the attributes of Queen Semiramis, or given to her in Babylon, were passed on in Christianity to Mother Mary, like Virgin Mother, Queen of Heaven, and such like. So all this connects the secret societies, religion, and all the institutions of government and society in general. Now, another thing very appropriate is that there was a drama series in Britain some years ago called Spooks, and it was based on the security services of Britain, which are also secret societies, and they set the offices, the headquarters in this Spook series in this building, the United Grand Lodge of Freemasonry. Very, very appropriate because they're all connected. Well, this is Westminster Abbey, just across from the Houses of Parliament, and the church is fundamentally involved in this hierarchy of control. First of all, because it squeezes people's perception of reality and possibility and of their own power by telling them that all they need to know is between the covers of a single book, and they can't deviate from that, otherwise they're a blasphemer. And another part of it is that the church is also a secret society. See, the vast majority of people who go to church do so for reasons of what they're told the church is all about. But the inner core of the church is a secret society. And this is why, for instance, you've got the Twin Towers here at Westminster Abbey. And this is symbolic of the twin pillars that were said to stand outside the biblical Solomon's Temple, that it was claimed stood on the site of the big Islamic mosque in Jerusalem today, what the Christians call and the Jewish people call Temple Mount. These twin pillars can also be found absolutely at the center of the symbolism of Freemasonry, because that's all connected into this as well in terms of Solomon's Temple. And what you'll see many times with these cathedrals is the twin towers. And if you go inside these cathedrals, again and again, you'll see the black and white squares that you find in Freemasonic temples. So you have the outer church, which is most of it, which believes that it's there to follow the teachings of a book. Then you have the inner sanctum of the church, the secret society level, that knows that all this is a representation of something very different. And in terms of Christianity and the church, one of the great power centers in the world is Rome and the Vatican. And if we think about it, the Knights Templar, the Knights of Malta, the Jesuit order, Opus Dei, these major global secret societies are all connected into the Vatican. So the Vatican is not a church. It is a major center of this secret society network, of which the church is a fundamental part, not least keeping the people literally often on their knees and worshipping some external God who tells them what to do, what to think, what to believe, and therefore not opening their minds to the greater picture of what's really happening. And Westminster Abbey here, quite appropriately, is the place where the British monarchs have been crowned for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, because this is all part of it. Even more than that, this church is called a royal peculiar, which I think is peculiar to start with. But a royal peculiar means this abbey is owned by the monarch, currently Queen Elizabeth II. Everything connects into everything else in this hierarchy, and the people overwhelmingly have no idea what's going on all around them, because that's the way this hierarchy makes it happen and ensures that people are in ignorance of the control system that controls them. So what could possibly be happening with a symbolic sphinx here in London on the side of the Thames? And there's another one on the other side here. It's because these bloodlines that go back to the ancient world, the secret societies that they come through, manipulating through to modern times, use the same symbols and perform the same rituals that they have for hundreds and thousands of years. And here, beside the Sphinx, is an amazing thing, really. Well, this, standing next to the Sphinx, is Cleopatra's Needle, an original obelisk from Egypt that stands on the side of the Thames. There's an original obelisk, again, from Egypt, in the Place de la Concorde in Paris, another major city for this hierarchy. And Princess Diana passed that obelisk just before she died in the Pont d'Alma tunnel. And there's also a original obelisk from Egypt in Central Park in New York, and outside the Vatican in St. Peter's Square. And this is not by accident. These symbols from the past have been brought through to modern times because these bloodlines today do the same rituals and use the same symbols that they've used all along. The only thing is that in more modern times they've gone underground, whereas before they did it openly. Another example of what I'm saying about the fact that this hierarchy of bloodlines and many of their gophers worship the same gods in the same rituals as they have through this period of thousands of years that the bloodline came out of Sumer and Babylon in the Middle East and through Rome and the Roman Empire and then up into Northern Europe and the British Empire and so on. This is a museum now, and it's on the site within the City of London, the city, the financial district, where the original Roman settlement was. And they found a temple when they were knocking down or building a building or something. They found underneath the temple to Mithra here in the City of London. And Mithra was a major Roman god. And if you look at the story of Mithra and all the things that are said about Mithra, they are just the same as what he said about Jesus in great detail. And of course, it was a Roman emperor, Constantine, at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, who effectively created what is modern Christianity and the worship of Jesus. And he had before been a worshipper of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. And basically, Mithra was replaced by Jesus, but the story, although in a different historical setting, was effectively the same. And if you look around the world, you find the Jesus story again and again in different cultures with a different name for the hero and a different historical setting. And of course, in the ancient world, they used to do sacrificial rituals to the gods openly. They used to sacrifice people and sacrifice children. And what happens now in the satanic rituals, the deep elite ones, is they still sacrifice children and sacrifice people. But they now, of course, do it secretly because it's not acceptable to the population anymore. And this is why Satanism and these secret societies and the banking system and the church and government and politics and all these other institutions are interweaved with Satanism, and also, for reasons I explain in the books, pedophilia, which is connected into Satanism in so many ways. So it's another example of the fact that we do have these two worlds, one that people think they live in, and the other that is nothing like the world that people experience, but it's the world that's controlling the world that people experience. Talking of secret societies and politics, behind me is the headquarters in London, actually between Buckingham Palace and the Houses of Parliament, of the Fabian Society, started in the 19th century. And it was begun with the idea of doing something for the working masses under the heading of socialism. But as usual, it wasn't the working masses that were running the show, it was the middle classes with the money and with the influence, and the Fabian Society is just the same. It doesn't claim to be a secret society, but I'm saying from its creation, at its core, it was and still is a secret society. It was very influential in the creation of the British Labour Party, which was formed with the official goal of representing the working masses and the poor. But of course the Labour Party over the decades has gone the way of the other parties, more and more representing the system. And Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, was very associated with the Fabian Society. And George Orwell, who wrote 1984, also knew a lot about the Fabian Society and wrote about them in less than flattering terms in his book, The Road to Wigan Pier. He was pointing out that when these working class organizations start up, it's the middle classes that actually run them. And he says in The Road to Wigan Pier, and by the way, George Orwell didn't come from a working class background either. He came from a background with money, and so did Jeremy Corbyn, the current leader of the Labour Party even. And George Orwell says in The Road to Wigan Pier in 1937, "The ugly fact is that most middle-class socialists, while theoretically pining for a classless society, cling like glue to their miserable fragments of social prestige." This is the hierarchy again. He names some of the people that were at the heart of the Fabian Society, and he says they're not exactly proletarian writers. "Sometimes I look at a socialist," Orwell said, "the intellectual track-writing type of socialist, with his pullover, his fuzzy hair, and his Marxian quotation, and wonder what the devil his motive really is. It is often difficult to believe that it is a love of anybody, especially of the working class, from whom he is, of all people, furthest removed. The underlying motive of many socialists, I believe," said Orwell, "is simply a hypertrophied sense of order. The present state of affairs offends them not because it causes misery, still less because it makes freedom impossible, but because it is untidy. What they desire basically is to reduce the world to something resembling a chessboard, which is what the world is. This is how the world is played by this hidden hand. Take the plays of a lifelong socialist like George Bernard Shaw. How much understanding or even awareness of working class life do they display? The truth is," he goes on, "to many people calling themselves socialists, revolution does not mean a movement of the masses with which they hope to associate themselves. It means a sect of reforms which we, the clever ones, are going to impose on them, the lower ones." And we see this in the Labour Party in Britain now. This momentum that's running the Corbyn side of the Labour Party is run by a very, very rich man. And, you know, again, this hierarchy makes sure that its people are in the right places to keep the hierarchy intact. And so many people who claim to stand for the working classes actually stand for the system they claim to oppose. So, we've looked at the secret societies that operate in the hidden, in this web I've talked about, where you have the spider at the center and then the secret societies coming out from the spider. And there's a point in that web that I call the cusp organizations, where the hidden comes through to the scene. And what has been decided in the shadows, in the realm of the spider, if you like, plays out through government agencies, governments, through the banking system, the media, and all these institutions of human society. And there are a number of organizations, the one behind me is one of them, that I would call these cusp organizations. In 1920, this organization behind me, called Chatham House, or the Royal Institute of International Affairs, was created by a secret society called the Round Table. It was a secret society created by the Rothschilds and funded by the Rothschilds. And it was formed in the latter part of the 19th century, and its first head was someone called Cecil Rhodes, who was a Rothschild frontman who plundered southern Africa for the Rothschilds in terms of the diamonds and the gold mines, etc. And this secret society based in London called the Round Table then started creating these satellite organizations, the first one being this one, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in 1920, followed in 1921 by the Council of Foreign Relations in America, which was brought into being through another famous Webb family, the Rockefellers. And since 1921, the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations have worked closely together, and the Council on Foreign Relations has, to a very large extent, driven American foreign policy ever since. Other organizations that followed in this Round Table satellite group include the Bilderberg Group, created in 1954, also the Trilateral Commission, which was another Rockefeller operation, which came in 1972-73. The Club of Rome is another one, which came in the 1960s to specifically exploit environmental concerns to transform global society. That's where the whole climate change caused by human activity hoax comes out of, that whole manipulation of environmental concerns to justify changes in society that would not otherwise happen. So these cusp organizations, they gather together politicians, people from business and banking and intelligence, military, all these different journalism, all these different institutions of society to develop a common policy that then plays out into human society, at which point it seems to be happening randomly, but it's not. It's all manipulated and coordinated through these various organizations. And one other thing, as I stand here outside Chatham House, the Round Table Secret Society was also the means through which Israel was manipulated into being, because an inner circle initiate of the Round Table was called Lord Arthur Balfour. Yes, he of the Balfour Declaration that declared that the British government supported a homeland for Jewish people in what was then Palestine. And the declaration, which when you hear about the Balfour Declaration, you think it maybe stood up in Parliament and declared it, was actually a letter sent by Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild, who created and funded the Round Table Secret Society. So this is how the world really works. This is how decisions are really made. This is how human society is really directed. Well, here we are back at the temple, at the point there where the temple becomes the city of London, the centre of banking and finance, and one of the centres of global power, not least in the financial area. And at that point where you enter the city of London is the flying reptile there in the middle of the road. Just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. And if you go in an exact straight line, I've just been told by someone who should know, in that direction, from that flying reptile, you will come straight into the other two reptiles that we saw earlier at another entrance to the City of London. So, we've talked about the law in the temple, control of the law, which this hierarchy must have to initiate and play out its power. And now we're going down there to one of the great centers of global power, in many ways, in terms of human society, the great center, and that is the control of finance. Behind me is the Bank of England, and we've come down from the bloodline through the secret society network that does the bidding in secret of the bloodline to manipulate society. And the next level of control is control of money. Now, these central banks, like the Bank of England, are coordinated globally in their policies through something called the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, where the heads of the central banks meet and coordinate policy. This whole banking network locks into the secret society network. It's actually one web. But the control of money in society as it's structured is control of choice. And what is freedom except choice? The more choices you have, the more freedom you have. The fewer choices you have, the less freedom you have. And money, to such a fundamental extent, dictates choice. How many people are not doing what they really want to do with their lives because they don't have the money to do it? And so control of money is fundamental to this whole hierarchy. And that's why the banking system is so high in its structure. And it's all based, the banking system, on a simple but devastating hoax. Lending people money that doesn't exist, called credit, and charging them interest on it. And when you take a loan from a bank, say £50,000, the bank doesn't do anything except type into your account £50,000. It doesn't move precious metals or anything anywhere. It just puts the figures in your account. Because banks, because of this hierarchy, legislation has been passed by the politicians the hierarchy controls that give banks the right, under something called fractional reserve lending, to lend far, far more money than it actually has, and it's called credit. Now, when you take out this credit, which is just fresh air, conjured out of nothing, figures on a screen, you have to give collateral to the bank, resources that do exist, your home, your car, your business, your land, your resources. And if you don't pay back the money you've borrowed that doesn't exist, credit plus interest, I'll get to that in a second, then the banks can take your wealth that does exist. And in this way, through the centuries, the real wealth of the world has been sucked out of the people into the hands of this elite by swapping fresh air, credit for wealth that and resources that do exist. Fire brigade coming past here. It's what we need, a fire brigade. Sort this lot out. Anyway, in terms of interest, when you borrow that £50,000, they put into your account £50,000, but you're not paying back £50,000. You're paying back £50,000 plus interest. The interest is never created. So therefore, there is never at any point enough money, theoretical or otherwise, units of exchange, in circulation to pay back all the debt and all the interest on the debt. So people losing their homes, their businesses, their land, their resources, etc., is built into the system. And when there is a boom, Peter paying Paul can hide that, but when there's a recession, then it becomes plainly obvious there's not enough money in circulation to pay back all the debt and interest on the debt. And then what happens? The banking system gets all those resources in return for its fresh air credit. And this is the major controlling system of human society. And these secret societies and families, bloodline families, control this whole deal. And that's why we are reaching the point now where a handful of people, literally a handful of people, own as much wealth as the poorest half of the world population, a world population in excess of 7.5 billion. This, to a very large extent, is how the 1% became the 1%. This statue of the Duke of Wellington outside the Bank of England is so appropriate, and there's a story regarding him which is, again, so symbolic and a wonderful example of how this whole deal works. The Duke of Wellington was the leader of the British forces against Napoleon in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. At that time, the House of Rothschild, which is the dominant force through the years of this city of London in terms of the families, Nathan Rothschild was head of the Rothschild Empire in London. And the Rothschilds at that time had a far better secret service network, if you can use that term, the equivalent of today's intelligence agencies. They had a better one than the British government. And so the situation here in the city at the time was, if Wellington won the Battle of Waterloo, stocks would go through the roof. If Napoleon won the battle, stocks here would crash. So what Nathan Rothschild did, and this is all officially accepted, is that he got his, if you like, secret service courier system to get news of who'd won the battle, Wellington, from the battleground to the city first. So Nathan Rothschild was the dominant person in this area and the stock exchange, etc. And so people were keeping their eyes on him because they knew he had this insider knowledge quicker than the government. And he played on the fact that he was not happy, and he arranged for his stocks, some of his stocks, to be sold. And people said, Rothschild knows. Napoleon's won the Battle of Waterloo. And they all started panicking and selling stocks, and the stock market crashed. At the same time, Rothschild had a stream of people secretly buying up those stocks, not under his name obviously, at knockdown prices. And then, when the news came officially through the government sources that Wellington had won the Battle of Waterloo, of course the stocks went flying up again. And the wealth and control financially of the Rothschilds went into the stratosphere in the city of London, and people who'd panicked because of this hoax lost their fortunes, and people were jumping off buildings. Now, that happened long ago, but it still happens today, where the stock market is manipulated and the banking system is manipulated by those who have the greatest power in terms of control of money. If a stock market goes up, that can be because the major players have got into the market. Stock market goes down, it's because major players have got out of the market. They are controlling it, whether it goes up or down. It's not by chance, it's by design. And in this way too, these families are constantly doing a Rothschild and gathering more and more wealth through the manipulation of stocks and shares and currencies. It's a total scam, and it's all going on in this other world that the vast majority of the population know nothing about. Now, so far on our journey down the hierarchy of human control, we've dealt with the bloodline, we've dealt with the secret societies, we've dealt with the control of the law, the control of banking. And you would think at this point we might just get down to elected politicians, but no. The next level in this hierarchy we need to talk about is the military. Behind me is the Ministry of Defense in London. And of course, you've got the Pentagon in the United States and their equivalent around the world. And what are the military? They're always there. No matter who comes into the positions of power in politics, the military is always there. It's part of the permanent state, the deep state. And what the military do ongoing, much of it is absolutely never known by the presidents, the prime ministers and the elected politicians. They're just here today, gone tomorrow. The military is always here. So if you think of the so-called DUMBs, the deep underground military bases around the world, not least in the United States, the President of the United States doesn't know what goes on there. He's not making decisions about what goes on in the underground bases. Same in Britain. The military are. And if you get to who's making the decisions about what's going on in the secret bases and underground bases, you're much closer to who's actually calling the shots of the world than you are looking at elected politicians with fancy titles like president. So the military is a strata of this hierarchy that's always there. And what is it always there to do whenever it happens? To suit the agenda, to start wars on people, to kill vast numbers of people, to acquire land on behalf of the hierarchy through invasion, etc. So we shouldn't think that the military is controlled by the politicians. The military is part of the permanent state, and thus the politicians are its pawns ultimately and not its masters. And by the way, before we leave this spot, next to the Ministry of Defence, actually the Ministry of Attack, is New Scotland Yard, the headquarters of the London Police, in fact the biggest, most important police force in Britain. And that's also a tool of the permanent state, not least because it's always there as well. And it's not the people's police force. It's Her Majesty's police force, just as it's Her Majesty's everything. Her Majesty's Treasury, Her Majesty's this, Her Majesty's that, Her Majesty's Passport Office. This is all the, part of the way the hierarchy works. And this is why the police don't ultimately serve the people, they serve the hierarchy and what benefits the hierarchy. Well, this is the headquarters of MI6, and interlocking with the military is military intelligence and the secret services, security agencies. And they are again part of this permanent state, this permanent government. They're always there. And note it's MI6, which means Military Intelligence Section 6, military intelligence. Just down the bank here is MI5. That's the domestic security agency. This is the British Overseas Security Agency. And it's again MI5, Military Intelligence Section 5. It's not PI5 or PI6, People's Intelligence 6, or even GI6, Government Intelligence 6. It's MI6, military. And who do they answer to? Like, who do the police answer to? Ultimately, in this hierarchy in Britain, the Queen, not the people. They don't swear an oath to the people when they take office. They swear an oath to the monarch, because this is how this permanent government works. And so these agencies like the CIA and MI6, etc., like all of these organizations, at their core, they are a secret society. And it's so appropriate that this building here is built as a pyramid, basically, because you've got this hierarchical pyramid, which is how all these organizations and the hierarchy as a whole is structured, whereby only the people at the top have the knowledge of what it's all about, and the further you go down, the less that they know. So there'll be many, many people working for MI6 that don't know the real controlling force behind MI6. And it's not the government, and ultimately it's not even the military. It's this hidden hand that controls the military, the government, banking, and the intelligence agencies. So, at last, here we are, having come down this hierarchical pyramid, all so far in the permanent government, the deep state, that which is always there. And only now have we reached the point coming down where we hit elected politicians. This is Downing Street, like I say, the home of the British Prime Minister. And what do Prime Ministers do? They come and they go. What do politicians in general do? They come and they go. But what we've seen so far, this hierarchy of the permanent state, is always there permanently. And thus, that's where everything's controlled from, decided from, and ultimately run from, and not here. But you see, what you have is all these people, and most of the public in general, they'll focus on the Prime Minister. Oh, what's the Prime Minister doing? Oh, she's terrible, or he's this, he's that. And the politicians, and, you know, I agree with them. You know, the politicians are basically lousy. But we shouldn't forget that they operate within a parameter, within a limitation of the agenda being dictated outside of their sphere of influence. So, extraordinary as it may be, the Prime Minister of this country, the President of the United States, he's not ultimately calling the shots. The deep state, the permanent government, is doing that. We're standing here in the centre of the road with the Ministry of Defence over there, Downing Street there, and Parliament down there, is the cenotaph. You see these all over the world, these monuments to what it calls there the glorious dead. I would put it another way. Yes, they gave their lives for what they thought was fighting for their country and fighting for freedom. But who is creating these wars to change the face of global society? If you look at the two world wars, before the First World War, power in the world was in far more hands than it was afterwards. And after the Second World War, power was in fewer hands than ever. And then, of course, we've had this massive globalization and there's more and more wars that have gone on that have further and further centralized power in the world. So wars serve this hierarchy of manipulation and control for many, many reasons. Not least, it leads to the centralization of power. And something else, when you've had a war, if it's a country or a world, that country or world is never the same again. Not reversible. That society, that status quo has changed. And that's one of the major reasons for wars. There are many others. So the population, the masses, are manipulated to fight wars created by this hierarchy. And when are we going to stop doing it? Because as they used to say in the 60s, how would they have a war, basically, if no one turned up? How could they have a war if the masses didn't fight each other? It's got to stop, or this is going to go on. And so, from Downing Street, we come to the Houses of Parliament, where I was going to say elected politicians reside, but only partly, because there's one part of the Houses of Parliament called the Houses of Commons, where people are voted for in elections, and the other half is called the House of Lords, and they are appointed. The public have no say whatsoever in those people getting into Parliament and making decisions that affect their lives. And we call it a democracy. And this is how this scam works. In every country, you have two parties, sometimes three, but usually two, that have any chance of forming a government. In this country, it's the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. In America, of course, it's the Republicans and the Democrats. So you vote for Party A, and they get into government, and you don't like what they're doing. So election comes along, and you vote for Party B. But because this structure of permanent government is continuing the same direction, irrespective of who's elected or not to Parliament or Congress, nothing changes when Party B comes in to what was happening under Party A. Now you've got a choice at the next election. If you want to get rid of Party B, the only way you're going to do that is vote again for Party A. And so it goes A, B, A, B, B, A. And it's called the people having a voice. They don't. Because while the parties come and go, and the politicians come and go, this permanent state is continually pushing the same agenda. That's why nothing changes. That's why people say in America, it doesn't matter who you vote for, the government still gets in. Yes, the permanent government. And we've got a wonderful example here behind me. These people, bizarrely, from my perspective, are protesting to call for Brexit, the UK leaving the European Union, to be stopped. Now, we had a referendum in this country, and the majority voted to leave the EU. And the European Union is part of this structure of incessant centralisation of power, driven by this permanent government, because the EU is there to take power to the centre and take it away from sovereign governments. And this is what's happened again and again and again since Britain joined the EU. So a majority of the people who voted in the referendum got sick of this, and they voted to come out. Now, that's the people speaking in a democracy. But the majority of people, politicians, including overwhelmingly the unelected ones in the House of Lords, do not want us to leave the EU, and now they're trying to thwart and stop the will of the people, because the will of the people is against the will of this permanent state that wants the incessant centralisation of power in every area of our lives. So now we've got a protest, talk about Turkey's demanding Christmas, to stop coming out of the EU. And they're saying that Parliament must have a say in the final vote because of parliamentary sovereignty. This is the parliamentary sovereignty that's been given away by these characters year after year after year since Ted Heath, the Prime Minister of the time in the early 1970s, and read my books about him, signed us in. And so we have a situation where people are demanding that they are centrally controlled by bureaucrats they can't even name. And the will of the people, irrelevant, doesn't matter. The will of the permanent government is all that matters, and these people have been pulled into the will of the permanent government without even realising there's a permanent government. So there you go, just another day in the world of politics. Well, this is the London School of Economics, the LSE, a major centre for education. And it was created by the Fabian Society in the latter years of the 19th century. And it has produced a stream of left-wing politicians, what are called left-wing anyway, and those that support what we would call today the progressive mentality, and also those that have and still do play a major part in this hierarchy of global manipulation. For instance, one of the attendees of the LSE was a man called George Soros, the multi-billionaire who's now spending phenomenal tens of billions on his open society foundations to manipulate politics and events in Europe North America and elsewhere. Another major manipulator of the last decade after decade after decade after decade, he's left us now at a very great age, was David Rockefeller. He went here as well. And so too did President John F. Kennedy. So this is a real center for producing politicians and educating those that support this particular Fabian view of the world, if you like. And education is absolutely crucial in all its forms, not just here, to keeping from the target population this hierarchy and the nature of what's controlling it and to what end. So children come out of the womb, they go into the education system in a very short few years, and they're in that education system throughout their formative years, up into adult years, increasingly these days, and they are being given day by day by day by day at school, college, and university the systems, the hierarchies version of everything, and that is a major part of the programming process that gets the target population to see the world as this hierarchy wants them to see it, i.e. not seeing that the hierarchy exists and what it's doing. Well, here in Fleet Street, which is just a few steps down from the flying reptile in the middle of the road and just inside the City of London with its flying reptiles and basically Knights Templar logo, Fleet Street was, how appropriate, the great centre of the British newspaper industry. A lot of it's moved elsewhere now and to other locations. But the reason I stand here and talk about this point in the hierarchy is that the media, like education, are absolutely vital to keeping from people the real nature of the world and how it's controlled. Now, one way that the media keeps this from the target population is the vast majority of journalists are clueless on what I'm talking about in this video. Clueless. But at the ownership level and deep in these media organizations and the corporations that own them, more to the point, they do know about what I'm talking about, and they're trying to keep it from people. If you are a journalist and you want to talk about the hierarchy, how it works and who are members of it and what the agenda is, even if you take the trouble to find out, then you are not going to remain a journalist very long with a major corporation. You'll be out, and what you write won't get in the paper. And so the media and education together are vital in controlling the information that people receive and make sure that they only receive information that keeps them in the dark and keeps them in the perceptual bubble and doesn't open the world to them in terms of what's really happening and who's really in control. Well, this is Hyde Park, and in particular this spot, this area is known as Speaker's Corner, and it's where people come and stand on boxes and say what they've got to say, and people listen to them or heckle them or whatever. And this was designated a free speech Speaker's Corner in the 1870s, and people like Karl Marx, Lenin, George Orwell all came here to speak. And it's got a funny history, because not far from here there was another form of free speech, in fact very close to here, because this was near to somewhere called Tyburn Gallows, where between the late 12th and the 18th century the state hung an estimated 50,000 people, and before they were hung they were given the right to have their free speech, either to admit they were guilty, to make their claims that they weren't guilty, to have a go at the government or whatever, and then they were hung. And, you know, in many ways, as we see free speech disappearing so fast all over the world today, a lot of these things kind of come together, these strands, because this Speaker's Corner is basically like the free speech zones where they zone protesters off at G7, G20 or G whatever they choose next summits, where they can be away from the people they're protesting against and just say what they like, only behind fences. And free speech is not designated to a place or a zone. Free speech is free speech. The freedom to speak, the freedom to have your opinion. Of course, it's disappearing so fast, as I say, and we can see that so blatantly more and more. But in many ways, it is, symbolically anyway, like the people waiting to be hung at Tyburn Gallows, because you can have your free speech, but what's going to happen is going to happen anyway. And so people are allowed to stand up and say what they've got to say, but this structure, this permanent government structure, not just in Britain but globally, is imposing its agenda irrespective of what the public want, irrespective of what they say. And what we're seeing more and more now with the deletion of free speech is the ability of people to expose the fact that this structure exists and what it's doing. So it's squeezing all opposition. And we have really reached the point where we have got to stop cooperating with our own enslavement through non-violent, non-cooperation with this system of control, because it can only control us if we give our power to it. And that, of course, brings to mind a man who has his statue back in Parliament Square. So after our journey through the power centres of London, which basically represent the power centres of the world, we come from Speaker's Corner and that whole deal of free speech, which is disappearing, appropriately to a statue of this man, Mahatma Gandhi, who urged people, encouraged people to stop cooperating with their own enslavement. And you know, this statue was put up in Parliament Square, the Houses of Parliament are over there, because, you know, once people have left us, like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, people that stood for justice and looked injustice in the eye and refused to blink, who gathered people together to realize the power we have if we stop fighting among ourselves and realize where the real power is. And it's not with them. And it's not with this hierarchy. It's with us, but only if we stop squabbling among ourselves and open our eyes to what's really going on. And so we have a Martin Luther King Day in the United States, because now he's gone. That's okay. Oh, he was a great man. Mahatma Gandhi, oh yes, we'll put up a statue in Parliament Square. He was a great man. But at the time, they were abused, attacked, talked in terms of what we would see today as he's a terrorist or he's a hate preacher, he's involved in hate speech. And yet, the people who now, from the system that fake Gandhi and Martin Luther King, if Gandhi and Martin Luther King were alive today, they would be treated exactly the same as they were when they were alive. Because people today who were standing up for justice in the face of gathering injustice, for freedom and freedom of expression in the gathering destruction of both, are abused in the same way that they were. You are a hate preacher, you are divisive, you are dangerous. Yes, people who stand for justice and freedom of expression are dangerous. Not to the people, not to the world, but to those that wish to impose injustice and destroy freedom. And we really have got to open our eyes to who is really controlling this world and how, and realize that any tyrant, any few seeking to control the many, have to divide and rule the many. And we see the fault lines of race and of income bracket and of culture and of religion all playing the target population off against each other. We don't just have to wake up this human race to what is happening. We have to grow up pretty damn fast and stop acting like playground children and playground bullies, allowing ourselves to be divided and ruled into an Orwellian tyranny. The power is not in these power centers I've been talking about in this video. They're the centers that people give their power to, and thus it's recycled back. We have to stop giving our power away. We have to stop fighting each other, and we have to stop, as this man said, cooperating with our own enslavement.